Yep, so just going to talk about the recovery plan for Canterbury and a bit of background on recovery, which is important. So I'm actually a recovery manager for Timaru District Council. I'm have done it in the past, and Paul is back up over there. And then we've got Darren, who is our civil defence response, so you probably all know. So I'll pass it over to Richard.
Kia ora koutou, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you today. And it's great to have your civil defence team here for when you've got the difficult questions. I'll be able to flick them to them to answer. Yes, so what I wanted to talk to you about today is recovery, which tends to be the bit of civil defence that tends to get overlooked. There's usually a big focus on response for good reason, but the recovery is a bit that gets overlooked. And what I'm wanting to talk to you about today is we've produced a draft plan, or a first iteration of a plan, which is about recovery, particularly from a large event. I'm not particularly concerned about small events, but the recovery effort increases exponentially with the size of the event. So what usually happens is people think, yeah, we can cope. Oh my goodness, we can't. And so wanting to think ahead of what are we going to do when your district or any other district, possibly in a big event, the whole region, suddenly says, actually, this is bigger than us and we need help. So that's really what this is about today. I'm happy to take questions as I go through. I can talk through a bit of a presentation and so happy to take any questions as we go. That particular photo there is from Hawke's Bay last year. They had jet boats going over the top of their house. They didn't even know there was a house underneath there. And they'd just taken, when I visited them on this day, they'd just taken all their belongings out, putting it out on the road to be taken away on a skip. So key messages for me. First of all, recovery is not just about what the council does. So restoring your council services, that's the job of your chief executive and his team. But the CDM role in recovery, and this is where Andrew and Paul, as your recovery managers, fit in, it's about coordinating all the different agencies involved. So they may be NGOs, such as your rural support trusts, working with farming groups. It may be government agencies like MSD, for example, with financial assistance, the whole range. And the CDM role is that coordination role. So everybody's joined up and looking and pointing in the same direction, which is different from restoring your own services. The second point, as I've got up there, is that it's long, it's complex, it usually costs a lot of money, and it involves an awful lot of people. Response tends to be short and sharp, and then the responders, in my experience, job done, and we'll pass this over to Muggins, who happens to be the recovery manager. And the third one is we're not prepared for recovery. And it was my recent experience in the Christchurch fires, where I was both controller and recovery manager because James Thompson was away on the Chatham Islands. He came back for a day and then he had COVID. So I managed to get both of them. And it really reinforced for me, actually, we haven't, despite my being in my role for 2 years and talking to people about it, we didn't have the staff and the structures and understanding needed to really swing into it. We got there, but actually from a recovery perspective, the fires was a really small event. Big in terms of response, but recovery, it's really small, and we still struggled. So what tends to happen is I say up there, it's often building the plane while flying it, and that's just not good enough, because what we find is the wings fall off fairly quickly. So we need to prepare now. As I say, the time to repair the roof is when the sun's shining, not when it's raining, and that's what this is about. So today I just want to give a bit of a context of it, talk about some of the key components of the plan. I'm not sure whether you've been given a copy. It's there, it's not a huge document, and certainly if you haven't seen it, it's available for you to look at if you want. And then just discussion in terms of whatever you want to ask or talk about. So just in terms of that context, I spoke about the 4 R's of civil defence, the first one being reduction, the second one readiness, and then response and recovery. 95% of what we do is actually in readiness, so it's trying to make sure we've got the systems and processes in place so that we can respond and recover. And that's really where this plan fits in. It's about being ready for the 4th R. People usually also say recovery starts on day 1 of an event. So yes, it should start during response because there's stuff that we can be doing in response that will help our recovery. Also, I think a lot of people would argue it actually starts in reduction in terms of reducing the risks in the first place as part of making sure we're ready for recovery. Just in terms of the definition and what we're talking about, so there's a definition on the Act, and you can read that for yourself, but I'll just sort of try and pull out a few things from it. First of all, it's about that coordination, so it's a coordinated efforts and processes. It's about different timeframes, the immediate, medium term and long term. And, in Christchurch, there are aspects of us still recovering from the Christchurch earthquakes. So it can be very long term. And I was talking downstairs, and in response, typically, you're thinking, what are we going to do tomorrow? Or long term is, what are we going to do in a week's time? Recovery is actually what's going to come up in 3 months, 6 months, 2 years, or longer. And just continuing with that definition, it's about holistic, so it includes all the well-being. So it's economic, it's social, it's environmental, it's cultural, goes across all of them. And often economic is actually, which is not usually a big part of your response. Response is about protecting people and property, and usually, the private sector will look after themselves. In recovery, a strong economy makes a huge difference because it not only gives people income, but it also actually getting back to work, sense of normality, purpose, those sorts of things. So it feeds into the social well-being as well. And then enhancement and regeneration. Again, I think if you're familiar with Christchurch today versus what it was 15 years ago, it's, in my opinion, a much better city because we were lucky enough to have quite a lot of funding poured into it. And the final thing in the context, as I've set up there, it's the CDM role is about leadership and coordination. It's not about needing to do everything, but just making sure all of the dots are joined up, which is different from your usual council services. And so just thinking about where we're at in terms of recovery, and there's what I regard as a recovery maturity model based on some work I did before I took up my role, going from unaware through to fully ready, or as ready as you'll ever be. So the first bit being aware of what it's about, having a basic plan, and I'd say this is very much in the basic plan category. A full plan to me is that you've got you've actually thought about the resources you need to run your plan. You've got your training, your exercises done, all that sort of stuff, and then fully testing it in exercises and experienced. At a group level, I would say we're probably about a 2 out of 10 at the moment. So that's and that was reinforced for me. So with the fires, we're wanting staff. The staff I got were great, but they'd never done recovery before. They weren't trained. So we're having to work through everything as we went through it. Sorry, what's that?
For that recovery, where did those staff come from? Did they come from ECAN or from?
Yeah, so a mixture of ECAN and Christchurch City. So the fire was largely in Christchurch City, and although it was a group declaration, so I was involved, and we got some staff out of ECAN, and then also some. But it peaked at probably 5 people for 3 days. So it was actually a pretty small team, and that's, I think, all we needed for that event, because recovery isn't actually a big issue for it, compared with, perhaps other flooding events and so on.
My question too, you said 2 out of 10 for readiness. Is that resourcing and experience driven, or because it's a very low number?
Yeah, look, it is a very low number, and in some of the subsequent slides we might flesh it out a bit more, but particularly for a large event, the governance structures are very unclear. What's civil defence? The Act says that I can't be inconsistent with anything from the National Recovery Manager, and similarly your local recovery managers need to be consistent with whatever directions I give at the group level. But at the same time, you've got councils, and you've got all sorts of other agencies. And as we've seen, in the earthquakes, we had the Christchurch Earthquake Recovery Authority. With the extreme weather events in the North Island, we've got the Cyclone Recovery Unit created. Some people would have argued that actually it should be the National Emergency Management Agency is in charge when it comes to government. So even at that national level, it's really unclear, and it tends to be bespoke arrangements get invented on the day. And that's probably one of the key things that I'd like to work through, not just with yourselves, but through the Joint Committee, which is the mayors and Ngāi Tahu, is getting really clear about what's the governance structure, the management structure, how are we going to run it. Because I think if you can be clear on that, then you're clear about the accountabilities and who's in charge.
So can I tease that out a bit more?
Yep, sure.
So it's only just over a decade ago we had So it's just over a decade ago we had a major earthquake, and surely we're higher than 2 following that event, or have we just sat on our laurels? Because recovery is still going on up there, and I'm just sort of interested why it's so low. I'm just fascinated by that.
I think there's a number of things in that. My personal experience with Christchurch earthquakes, after the September earthquakes, in fact both earthquakes, I was working in Christchurch City Council. I had a little piece down the bottom of my job description that said, in a major event, you'll be recovery manager. There were 4 of us with that in our job descriptions. We thought, well, that's never going to happen. It was a bit of a rude shock. But what actually happened when we started to do our jobs is we were asked not to do that by the chief executive because of some of the politics around it. And so after the February earthquakes, we then started to, we actually advocated for the Christchurch Earthquake Recovery Authority, and they took over. And there's a lot of people who I personally know who I think did a fantastic job in that and have got a lot of experience. But the way, again, in the floods last year, anybody who was involved in Sarah was persona non grata in Wellington because there was some stigma attached to it. They thought they hadn't done a good job. So I think in some ways we're not actually valuing the experience that has been gained. Yeah. And I think now particularly with large parts of the North Island being in recovery, and all sorts of questions being asked, and lots of different structures and models of how they organise themselves. I think now it's dawning on people, actually, at national level, we need to do better. Yeah, so there's lots of layers of human behaviour and politics going on. Yeah. There are a number of diagrams like this that can, available, but it just highlights again in terms of the nature and the context of recovery that as time goes on, the media interest drops away, the understanding, the will, the commitment to do stuff drops away, and that community starts to get frustrated and angry, and why isn't stuff happening quicker, and so on. Again, an example, sorry to keep harping back to the earthquakes, but I had a discussion with somebody 6 weeks after the September earthquakes in Christchurch, and they said, why, they lived in West Christchurch, why are people in East Christchurch still complaining the earthquake was 6 weeks ago? If you're in East Christchurch, you didn't have sewage, you're having to go out into the street to share a shower, that sort of stuff. There's just worlds apart. But if you're not actually in the thick of it, people often move on fairly quickly. And then at a personal level, it's often a bit of a roller coaster as well. And this will look different for everybody. Some people will initially do well and then go into that disillusionment. Some people go straight into disillusionment and then come out more quickly. Some people might go down and actually never fully recover. So there's all sorts of personal experiences. And as a recovery manager, you're needing to try and manage that at a community level. It's also a real balancing act because people are impatient to get things done and you want to do things quickly and you're trying to move things along. At the same time, it's often, when you lift up the hood, it's often a lot more complex than you think. And so trying to figure out what is the right thing to do. How do you deal with that complexity, but yet communicate that simply and clearly to people? How are you going to fund stuff? How do you do stuff without causing other problems down the line? So there's lots of things that you try and you're trying to balance, and so there's a bit of a scales or a seesaw that you need to think about and manage. And whatever you do, of course, as you as councillors know, there'll always be some people who don't like it. That's not news to you, right? Yeah. So this draft plan, from my perspective, is a first step, and part of it is actually just the opportunity to come and talk to you about it and start to raise the profile and start people thinking about how we might do things in an emergency, particularly a large or catastrophic event. So, as you can see up there, you're trying to build that shared understanding, trying to get that commitment to the roles and responsibilities and get some clarity around that. Thinking about where do you get the people and the funding to get started, because usually what happens is say that the response finishes, the response teams are exhausted, they think job done, and poor Andrew and Paul and their teams are going, well, now it's on us, as well as trying to do your day jobs and all those sorts of things. So being really aware of it's actually a heck of a lot of work. And it will go on for a long time. So getting that sustainability Funding's a really interesting one. Again, in the Hawke's Bay, a couple of the councils I was dealing with up there were saying, well, they'll be insolvent within 12 days if they continued at their current rate of spending. So in that case, the government came in, but as you're going through your LTPs and so on, thinking what is that financial headroom that we've got, and I know it's a really, really difficult process, but it's something to keep in mind. Yeah, indeed. Yeah. There's no easy answers, I'm afraid. Well, not from me, anyway. And secondly, in terms of the plan, is trying to identify a program of work that we need to do to enhance that readiness, and then scheduling and training exercises. So just some things to keep in mind in terms of recovery. That coordination is a key part of it. A lot of recovery actually occurs outside of civil defence and relies on goodwill rather than formal powers. So as recovery manager at the group level and your local recovery managers, and Andrew and Paul, we've got the power to evacuate buildings, close roads, demolish things, all that sort of stuff. But actually very little of that is about recovery. A lot of that is about continuing to protect lives and infrastructure and stopping people going back into dangerous places, like those sorts of things. So the actual recovery often falls back on using existing powers under the Local Government Act, under the RMA, and so on. And unless there's special legislation passed, which in a big event there may well be. Spoke before about that, understanding roles and responsibilities, because for me, even as a group recovery manager, where does my role finish? When does it finish? And when do we hand stuff back into some modified BAU arrangement with councils or other agencies? And that's quite unclear. But without getting that clarity early on, it can be very inefficient. At the group level, the top of the tree is a joint committee, which is, as I said, the mayors. That's a legislated committee under the Civil Defence Act. Alongside them, or not alongside them, reporting to them or advising them is also the KEG, which is the Coordinating Executives Group. So that's where all the executives are on, the chief executives of district councils, along with senior representatives from police and FENS and St John's and so on. For a large event, I'm proposing that if it's a Canterbury-wide event, a recovery board. And for me, this is primarily advisory rather than actually decision-making. And more than anything, it's providing me with the advice and support that I need, because in my experience, I don't think I would be able to get that from the Joint Committee in the way that I need it. So during a crisis event, all of you, if it affects your district, will be flat out. You'll be engaging with your community, doing whatever you can to help them. And what I need in my role is some people who know some stuff about recovery and the context in which it's happening, and can step back out of that and probably spend half a day at a time chewing through what are we going to do about this, helping problem solve and so on. So it's very much about augmenting the capacity and giving me the support that I need, so that our advice to the Joint Committee is as good as it can be. That's the intention with that, and that'll be going back for some further discussion around what that looks like. And then at the local council level, clearly governance sits around this table with yourselves.
So I might have missed this, but just on the last slide, you had this plan is for a large or catastrophic event. What kind of process do you go through? Like, do you just kind of know, or do you sit there and go, you know, it's this size, it's this scale, it's this many councils, we need to enact this plan?
Sure. So I think for it to be, to revert to this plan, it would probably, first of all, need to be bigger than a single council could manage on their own. Or it may be span across many councils. And again, I think the main things are you able to handle it yourselves? Or even if it's multiple councils, if they're all able to work on it, that's easy. And in a what I would describe as perhaps a moderate size event, which perhaps the 2021 floods, that involved a number of councils, and I wasn't in this role at that time. I would probably be more active in recovery than the group office was at the time. But that would be very much around supporting the local recovery managers and coordinating across districts and coordinating and advocating into central government about funding issues and those sorts of things, leaving your councils and your teams to probably be doing most of the stuff on the ground. If you need more resources, then that's something you request of me, and I scramble around and see what we can get from either other parts of Canterbury or kick it up to national and see what we can get from other parts of the country. So in terms of where does it sit, where this would really kick in, I think for me, would be clearly something like AF8 or a large tsunami, which might also be associated, if it's associated with something like Hikurangi. It's actually a really scary scenario because most of the North Island's in munted as well, so we wouldn't be getting support from them. Or it might be even a really severe weather event, bigger than probably the 2021 floods, but you know, something as I had in Auckland or Hawke's Bay, but over a bigger area. Or for another example might be one that in my personal opinion, we haven't thought about enough, and that might be a malicious infrastructure attack. So, you know, if you get a sustained attack that takes out your internet, pretty much everything shuts down, you know, including electricity supplies and all sorts of other things. And that can be absolutely paralysing if that went on for a sustained period.
That sort of feels to me, the way that's written, is your local governance is probably going to be set up and running before your group is. That's the way that reads. Maybe I'm reading it wrong. You know, just the words of recovery board as proposed. Well, actually, we should know that well before now. Because your local... Oh, sorry. I keep forgetting to turn the green on. So I'm just sort of interested in the dynamics there.
Yeah, so what I would like to see is us identify perhaps a pool of maybe 20 people who might, and then ahead of an event, and have discussions about who those people might be. And then if we're using that recovery board, you know, maybe it's 8 of them, depending on who's available and the nature of the event. And so that we can pull them together quite quickly. I think there needs to be some discussion, about who those people might be, who convenes them, how quickly do we bring them together. So there's some more definitely more discussion required around that and how it works. But I think what I'll be wanting to do is certainly bring them together while we're still in the response phase, still in that state of emergency, which in a large event may go on for, several weeks. Now, this is a rather horrendous diagram. Apologies for it, and the next iteration of this plan will be much simpler. But I'll even with glasses, it doesn't look much better. I'll just try and talk about some key elements of it. So I've spoken about the joint committee at the bottom there, with the mayors, the chair of Environment Canterbury and Ngāi Tahu. Going up from that to the left is the recovery board that I've spoken about, and I've put if required. For me, as I said, they're probably mainly an advisory board rather than actually having an authority. Then a group recovery office above them. So wherever it says group in civil defence, it's regional, is what it talks about. That's the language used in the Act. And it's made up of people like myself from Christchurch, who have that regional perspective, and all the individual councils. The way we organise ourselves in recovery is actually different from the way it's organised in response. So those recovery task groups, also called sector groups, also called recovery environment groups, depending on which document you read, and they tend to be representatives of particular environments or sectors. So as you can see in there, there's a natural environment, there's a social environment, there's the economic environment, there's built, and I think it's also probably that we would want to have a rural environment for most events in Canterbury, because that's because of the nature of our economy. And so they are groups with all the key players within that particular sector or environment. So in the social one, for example, you will have quite a few government departments who are heavily involved with that. You'd probably also have people like your rural support trusts who are providing support, and other NGOs in there. In the natural environment, you'd probably have the likes of Environment Canterbury, Department of Conservation and others, and so on and so forth. So, and that's actually where most of the coordination gets done. In the fires, we've set up one, and that's actually an environmental one, because most of the issues from the fires are actually about the natural environment and sedimentation coming down into rivers and loss of vegetation and stuff. There's not a big social impact at this point. Other events, social can be huge, economic can be huge, built can be huge. So what they are is they're bringing together the key players, in a room like this, so you can talk and coordinate across the different agencies involved. And at the regional level, the group office will be trying to facilitate those, bring them together, provide support in terms of secretarial support and program management and so on. Whether they get duplicated at a local level is a question, and it's a live question, because a lot of the government departments are not going to be wanting to do that in every district if it was a Canterbury-wide thing. So it may be, in fact, we have regional or sub-regional groups. In terms of council's involvement, actually you're involved at a whole lot of different levels. Clearly you're involved at that joint committee level through your mayor, In the group office, we will be working very closely, as we have just in the last few weeks with the fires, with local councils. You'll be making your own decisions, hopefully in a coordinated way through the structure. But, if it comes to spending your money or you're making decisions, it's your money. So, what you spend it on, what you prioritise, ultimately stays with you. The central government will also be involved at a number of levels as well, through their own departments, but also ministers and prime ministers taking an interest. The question about Ngāi Tahu involvement is a really interesting one. So in that diagram off on the left, I've got the Ngāi Tahu and Māori Recovery Rōpū. The intention of that is not everything Ngāi Tahu or Māori gets put to this group. That group is there to identify who they want representing them in some of those different parts of the structure, because that's somewhere, having worked for Ngāi Tahu for a couple of years, it's not somewhere I want to go and venture into that. I think Ngāi Tahu are a very political organisation in themselves, and who's in charge is up to them to decide who they want represent, who's mana whenua, and that's not just going to happen at the office of Turunanga or Ngāi Tahu in Christchurch. It has to be local. So there's multiple levels in which they're involved. And I've had some discussions with Ngāi Tahu around this, but there's a lot more discussion needs to happen. Most of the rest of the slides are probably, I'll flick through them, but they're actually sort of covering some of the things I've just spoken about in terms of some of the groups shown there. But also this one, just talking about local versus group office. So local, leading that engagement with your local communities, that local coordination, connecting and advocating interregional and national initiatives. You'll be doing some of your own operational activity, and I say such as welfare, that's something that will, in many events, carry on from the response phase, where you have civil defence centres where people can go if they're needing accommodation, or working through other agencies, and restoring your own services as part of that. At the group level, it's that coordination at that regional level. A big part of it is advocacy and funding to central government, trying to make sure that they get the message clearly. Stuff like policy advice, which requires or would benefit from a regionally consistent approach. So an example of that at the moment playing out in the North Island is the what's called FOSL, which is future of severely affected land, in other words, buyout or managed retreat from areas, and the government has come up with a proposal, 50-50 funding split, but there's a whole lot of policy around how do you actually do that, and different categories of homes affected, and what if somebody's insured versus somebody not insured, and just it's an absolute minefield. Doing that at every council doing that on their own, to me, is a colossal waste of time and money and effort. There are big legal bills associated with it. Doing it collectively, and say this is what we're proposing. You'll still have to make the decision, but at least we're not duplicating all that sort of effort. So those are some of the things that I see being done in the regional office. And then supporting local activities, and that might be, if you need staff to support, seeing what we can get from elsewhere.
Which means you have to have quite a visible regional group.
Yep.
With strong relationships, because I can just imagine, once they put, say, a funding bid up to Crown and it comes back and the local don't like it, there's going to be tension there as well. So that's going to have to be thought through as to, is every local bound by whatever comes their way? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It does get, those relationships are very important, and being able to have some fairly honest discussions become important. But also, I think, just being really clear and utilising all the connections we possibly can to influence government, so that, you know, you might have a discussion with a minister, and he might, he she might say, yes, that's great, but actually it can often be scuppered by officials underneath and the advice that they give. So trying to think about what other channels do we have to influence officials who might be providing the advice as well. So those are the sorts of things that I think, particularly actually a recovery board can be really useful if you've got people who are well connected in those circles.
Yeah, one of the things is the ministerial relationships as well with the Prime Minister, you know, because when it's a regional event and crosses many districts, each district tends to start competing for the funding and the exposure as well. So there's different invitations come out and ministers go visiting different areas. So there needs to be coordination in that, because at the end of the day, we're all competing for the same pot of funding.
And just feeding on Andrew's point, every fortnight I have a conversation with my counterparts nationally online for an hour. And one of the things about that is Canterbury is perceived as wealthy compared with some other parts of the country. And I was just out there before we came in, I was talking about something like Wairoa, for example, where the average income is 65% of the national average. Insurance levels were 50%, which is incredibly low. 80% of the houses had asbestos in them. So those sorts of things, you'd expect that they would get a higher level of government assistance than we might hear. And so there are those sorts of things that we do need to be cognizant of, but equally we want to be proactive and in there early, advocating as best we can for the people of Canterbury. I've spoken a little bit about the Recovery Board. Although I've labelled it a governance there, actually part of it for me is also probably, in some cases, would be tactical advice for myself in terms of getting stuff done. So I think it probably spans both. And membership to be decided. Recovery task groups, I've spoken about them. So these are the multi-agency groups that you pull together so you can have those conversations. Spoken about this particular rōpū in terms of helping determine where and how Ngāi Tahu and Māori interests are represented. And you can ignore the 1st of December, that was last year. But I'm very happy to receive feedback because we're still working on the next iteration of this document. Happy to answer any further questions.
Thank you for your presentation. AF8, some would say we're overdue, some would say it's definitely coming. Where are we in the preparation for AF8?
Yep, good question. So at the group level, there's a guy, Matt Clark, who's been doing some work around preparation, particularly for response. So we also have a national exercise coming up in June, July, called Ruwhenua. And then later on in the year, we're going to have another exercise, our usually annual exercise, Pandora, will also be based around that scenario. So there's certainly a lot of work going on at a number of levels to identify what the issues are. In terms of how prepared is your council, I will leave that for them to answer.
I'm happy to add to that. Yeah, definitely there's been a lot of work going on around AF8. Last year, particularly a series of workshops with all our agencies and stakeholders. Some really productive stuff that came out of there. Actually, much of that was understanding what we didn't really understand. And then, like Richard said, the focus this year is really pulling that together and exercising it so that we've got a better picture of it all. So it's definitely ongoing. It's just probably about putting a lot of those strands together now.
Yeah, I think from a response perspective, yes, there's a lot of work going on. From a recovery perspective, probably not so much, because it's going to be a long haul. We've seen that with just Christchurch. AF8 will be far bigger than that. And it will be years. There will be supply chain issues for a long time. And funding is going to be a major exercise, yeah. So, yeah, that's the bit that probably needs to be a bit more thought into.
So you're really focused on the Canterbury-wide initiative. So when, I presume at our local level, we have a event recovery plan in place, or we don't?
Hello, how are you? Look, I don't think we have a specific recovery plan in place at the moment, and I think that what Richard is touching on is the understanding that a lot of our preparation has been around that response sort of period, and I think this is a point that we need to start looking forward to that recovery and understand what that looks like. We've increased our recovery managers, for example, so I think that that's a good step in the right direction. And the exercises for AF8 that we've talked about will have a focus on recovery, or at least won't just be around the initial response phase. We'll exercise a few days later as well, which is a really important thing to get our head. Day one is probably not our challenge. Day 5 is our challenge, and it's understanding that and getting on top of that.
So we talk about funding, but I'm not sure the funding sits there ready. And if we're going to be doing recovery, surely that's one of the things we're going to have to start sorting out earlier, well, nowish, because, you know, the councils have got headroom, but that won't last long if you've got a alpine fault, and probably the earthquake recovery fund's probably pretty well exhausted from Christchurch. So I think there's a bigger conversation to be had from central government, local government, all the way down. And is that actually happening, or is that, all right, that happens, let's now just go out and acquire stuff and worry about paying for it later?
It's a combination, it's a combination of things. I mean, we've got someone from LGFA coming shortly. It's, you know, increasing the ability to borrow within those things. I mean, it could be overnight, you know, a stroke of a pen could actually enable another $100 million, whether you want it or not.
But someone's still got to have that
thought
before.
Yeah, no, totally. So, yeah, but what local authority wants, you know, it'll be fascinating watching those central, and I would say they're actually pretty lined up. They had strong relationships, some of those ones in Central Hawke's Bay, in a pretty good place, but they still weren't comfortable with what they got from central government. So that's going to be ongoing for years and years, but it'll be fascinating watching just their rate increases, et cetera, and their ability for their communities to pay. We're lucky we're actually on a low rating base. Look at Kaikoura as an example. You know, after their earthquake, what did they make a decision to jump up 20 or 30% or something? But at the time, the community said, yeah, we'll do that because this is exactly what we need to do. So, yeah, I mean, I see the challenge in it, but I don't think it's, you know, insurmountable.
I think, yeah, the environment has changed a lot in recent times as councils head up towards their debt limits, or, you know, and it's right across the board, across the whole country. We know that it's an issue with infrastructure. so previously. So I think, yeah, there probably does need to be a little bit of work on that debt area because, you know, you take the Nelson flood event, that was $80 million. You know, that was a phenomenal hit. And of course, the change in government policy now is any sort of red zone land, it's now 50-50 share. Councils pay 50% of it. So it's, yeah, there's certainly emerging. I think, yeah, perhaps a little bit more work there needs to go on, perhaps talking with funding agencies.
You'd think they have had a conversation, the funding agencies, to some extent. Surely they must see, I mean, they've got a range of councils, they've got councils that are, you know, over those covenants at the moment as far as, you know, they're above 2.8, the larger council. So, you know, there must be something that's had a conversation above our pay grade, I would hope.
I was simply going to add that we are on a maturity journey and we're right at the very beginning of it in terms of recovery. So we've all been all whiz-bang, jazz hands and all the rest of it around response for a few years. And we're not too shabby in Canterbury in particular in terms of response, but we're a long, long way from being fit for or match fit in terms of recovery. But I think that's the whole country. And as Richard has alluded to, I think we're probably a 2 out of 10. But we are trying to make steps towards it, and funding of it that'll be a component of it. But again, we're pretty immature about all that stuff in terms of what recovery really means until we're in the thick of it. It seems to be how we're operating at the moment, yeah.
But in answering probably Councillor Scott's question about recovery planning, that the recovery plans are actually written day 2 of the response effectively. So yeah, and each event is different. I've been through a few of them now. I've written a recovery plan or 2. But yeah, they are different. They have different focuses. Yeah, sometimes it's about people and property. Other times it's about the environment or economic. And I think economic is one that tends to get overlooked a bit. Yeah, but businesses are incredibly important.
Yeah, I might just chuck in a couple of comments. First of all, going back to the issue of funding, I think the North Island severe weather event has, because it affected so much of the New Zealand population, I think it's bumped that visibility up a bit in terms of both central government, but also anything that affects Auckland, for example, is a big chunk of New Zealand. So I think within central government, I think there's now much more awareness than there was, and there seems to be much more appetite. The Minister, for example, asking the NEMA about recovery, not just about response. Also, there have been a number of discussions within Wellington among government departments about how they're going to respond to a major event, particularly ones that affect Wellington. And that's been a real eye-opener, I think, for a lot of the chief executives of government departments who initially thought it was alarmist, but now they're actually getting a sense, well, hang on, this could be really catastrophic. And with something like the Hikurangi subduction zone off the lower North Island, major earthquake, but also a big tsunami, and the modelling for that is about 40,000 dead. So when you start to get into that scenario, you start to really get a sense of how precarious this may be. And so I think that there is an increasing awareness of both the practicalities and the funding and all the other things that go with it.
I do worry how serious people take it after our COVID pandemic around modelling. You know, this country got killed with data and modelling, and did it eventuate? Some would say no. So it's a really tricky position to be in when you start modelling and not scaremongering, that's because it's real, but you know, like, it's very tricky going forward, I think, in this country.
Yeah, and it might be 50 years away, or it might be next Tuesday, and you just don't know.
we make it the Tuesday after, 26th? 4 hours of council meeting, so that'd be ideal.
We've learned that Richard has the capability to kill a lot of things, so maybe he should come to the 26th of March.
There again, just to maybe end us on a positive note, if you look at, I'm trying to find a positive in this conversation, but, you know, if you go to a Christchurch, look at, you know, what's risen from the ashes, and, you know, there's some horror stories in behind it, but actually it's a community that's turned themselves around and done pretty well. So, yeah, on that note, let's, no. But, I mean, that's it. It's communities coming together, isn't it? And I did like the slide on the, you know, what is it, the hero and all that, and then it's like, oh, it's day 5, the communities, you know, no one plans past day 3. That's when people run out of food and all those sort of things. So, you know, that's challenging our role, isn't it, around that education piece and actually getting people ready. Yeah.
How many of us in here already?
What's that?
How many of us sitting around the table?
We're just going to go out to our local potato farmer.